Hello and good evening. Welcome to this evening's PCS Facebook Live. I'm Fran Heathcote, President of PCS, and joining me tonight will be our General Secretary, Mark Serwotka. The event is being streamed on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. So can I just encourage you to share and retweet as widely as you can so that we get as much coverage as possible. Can I also give a really warm welcome to our British Sign Language interpreter, Sam Riddle. Sam's here to make sure that the event is as accessible as possible. And obviously, Mark and I are trying to be mindful of that and make sure we speak in a way that it is not too fast and that Sam can follow all of that. So welcome, Sam. We meet at a really important time in terms of our national campaign, a time when there's lots to update you on. So we want to make best use of the time we've got. The event is probably not going to run for much more than an hour, but in that time, what we'll do is hand over to Mark. Mark will give us an update on the current situation, all the issues we're facing, what we're dealing with, and what we're asking you as PCS members to do as part of this campaign. And then we'll make sure that there's plenty of time to take questions and comments and contributions that you may have. So in the usual way, if you could put your questions into the comments box. If you have my contact details, don't send them to me directly because I don't get them. If you put them into the comments box, our admins will make sure that they're fed through to me, and I'll try and ensure that we cover as much ground as we can. In the usual way, if you've got solidarity shout outs, then send us those as well. And I think they are also going along the screen as I'm talking. So thank you for those, and obviously keep those coming. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark Serwotka, our General Secretary. Mark's going to give us a bit of an overview and a bit of an update on where we are. And then, as I say, we'll open the meeting up for your comments and questions. So over to you, Mark.
Well, thanks very much, Fran, and good evening to everybody. And can I thank people for giving up their time to join us tonight. Obviously, next week, Fran, we will start a ballot where every member who's been involved in our campaign will receive a ballot paper, either by email, if we've got your personal email address, or in the post. And what we want to use tonight's Facebook Live for is to ensure that everybody is fully up to speed with where we're at, try to deal with some of the common questions that has been raised with us over the last couple of weeks, and then, most importantly, give people the opportunity to ask anything that they want tonight. So what I want to do in explaining how we've got to where we are, Fran, is to pick up some of the issues that have been coming up in communications that we've received. But I think the first thing to say is a big thank you to everyone who's on this call. and everyone who's been active in PCS over the last 12 months. There has been the biggest amount of strike action in Britain for decades over the last year. That started in the post office and in the railways, but then moved into huge parts of the public sector. And it all happened because we're in an unprecedented cost of living crisis. Inflation, food inflation, was running at one point at 19%. And most parts of the public sector, and specifically us in the civil and public services, have had a decade of pay restraint that has meant in real terms, whether you're a civil servant working an arm's length body, whether you're a teacher or a health service worker, your pay in real terms will have gone down by anything between 10 and 20%. So the conditions of pay falling behind, a massive cost of living crisis, has meant that PCS, like many other unions, has been forced to take industrial action because the government, frankly, was not prepared to listen. And I want to thank everyone, because the industrial action that we have seen, which is 3 national one-day strikes and hundreds of days of targeted strike action, has meant we've seen the biggest amount of strike action in the civil service for generations. And whilst we were taking our action, we know that teachers have taken strike action, health service workers have taken action, and some of them continue to do so, and many other public sector workers have done the same. And as a result of the action that we've all taken, the government has been forced to make a significant shift in its position. They've done it in most parts of the public sector, but for us, importantly, they've done it for the first time ever. We've never seen before national strike action force a UK Westminster government to put more money on the table. And the concessions the government have made, they've made because they've been forced to. And we should remember that when we started this campaign, we were told that the 2% we had last year would not be increased. We were told there was no prospect of any one-off lump sum payments. We were told to expect a pay remit for this year in the region of 2%. And we were also told that the government was determined to cut our redundancy terms and would not make any concessions on the other issues of concern around job security or indeed our overpayment of pension contributions. It is despite all of our efforts to persuade them through negotiations, through parliamentary lobbying, they told us no. And incidentally, they also told all the other unions no as well. And that was the backdrop to our industrial action. Now, PCS, like many other unions, therefore, have been forced to take action, and the government's been forced to move. And what we want to talk about tonight is what concessions they've made to us, what we know that means already, and what we are hoping to find out in the next few weeks before we make a final decision on how well or how poorly we have done, both in relation to inflation, other public sector pay awards, and then we can make a decision how to move forward. So the first thing to say is, as a result of the strikes and as a result of the pressure that we put on them, and that really we should always remember is due to the sacrifice members have made through unpaid action, paying the levy and taking targeted action, the government has made a move. Firstly, they've announced a one-off £1,500 non-consolidated lump sum payment. Secondly, they announced that the 2% pay remit would be increased to an average of 4.5%, with an extra 0.5% for the lowest paid. Thirdly, they conceded that the cuts to our redundancy scheme will not be made, even though it was a manifesto commitment of the Conservative Party, until the other side of a general election. And fourthly, they have conceded that there now must be national talks with the union around the problems with the structure of our pay. That means people get paid different rates of pay in different government departments, which means, for example, people who are AAs and AOs are now getting the same pay because they're on the national living wage, even they do work of different grades. They've been forced to concede national talks to see whether we can find a solution to those problems. The one thing we've made no progress on so far is pensions, and that is because the government are adamant that they will not negotiate to us whilst these cases are going through the courts. And hopefully by now you'll have seen our publicity that makes it clear that we've been given leave to appeal the decision on pensions, and we have very strong legal advice, which, if we are successful in the Court of Appeal, should mean that we can make progress on getting back the £2,000 overpayment on average that most people have made now since April 2019. So those concessions have only taken place because of the action that you've taken. But your union leadership is clear that welcome though those concessions are, they are not enough for us to end our campaign or end our dispute. And the reasons for that, I think, are clear, but they're worth repeating. Firstly, we did not want a non-consolidated one-off lump sum payment. We believe that payments should be consolidated, they should be pensionable, and they should be there for all time on the pay scales. The government has refused to shift from its position of a one-off payment, and indeed their case is it's exactly how they have treated other people in the public sector, particularly the health service. Secondly, we remain very unhappy that the £1,500 we were told would go to all staff has in fact been prorated for part-time workers. We believe that is completely unjust, and we are determined to carry on campaigning to ensure that part-time workers get the full £1,500 payment, the same as everyone else. The government have refused to shift on that point to date, and indeed they have told us that the proratering is exactly what they did in the health service and what they would have done for teachers had they not withdrawn the one-off payment to the teaching unions. Thirdly, we believe that whilst it's welcome that the pay remit has more than doubled from 2% to 4.5%, that is less than the rate of inflation and indeed is less than the government's pay review bodies have recommended should go to health service workers, to the police, to the senior civil service and to teachers. We remain of the view that we deserve at least the same level of pay rises as everybody else. Therefore, the union believes that concessions have been made and they've only been made because of our campaign, but there can be no question that we say we've got enough. The issue, therefore, for us in the ballot that's going to happen next week is how, therefore, do we move our campaign on to put more pressure on the government to ensure that we can get better than they have already put on the table. And that's the key question that we hope will come up in questions tonight and that we want members to vote in the ballot next week to address. Now, the NEC believes that because the concessions are not enough, it is almost certain that later on in the year, or possibly the beginning of next, particularly as the government seems to be indicating that in its last year in power, it's going to take a very tough line with all public sector unions later this year or next, that it is very likely the union is going to have to reconsider and take further industrial action some point later this year or early next. Therefore, the view that we have is how best can we ensure that members get the most we can get them now through talks, but give us the time to build the union, build our fighting fund, and prepare for a further round of industrial action should it be necessary, particularly if that coincides with other public sector unions who will be in the same position as ourselves. So what we did in the run-up to deciding to have a ballot of members was we ran a consultation exercise, and we asked all branches to hold all members' meetings and tell us whether people felt they were in a position to take further strike action now, or whether people believed that we should pause the industrial action, get into the talks that your strikes have won, to ensure that every member is clear what consolidated pay rise they're going to get in 2023, whether or not they got the £1,500 one-off payment, and what the national talks that you have won through your strike action have delivered. And therefore, we believe that the overwhelming logical step to take is to tell the government we are not settling our dispute, but to get into the talks with every individual employer so that you know wherever you work what consolidated pay rise you're going to get in your grade with your employer, and crucially also so that you know whether the national talks with the government that are due now to start next week make any significant move in the structural problems in our pay, particularly for people on the national living wage, but also to deal with the question of people getting different rates of pay in different parts of the civil service. So I think, therefore, it's important that at this point, how I sum that up, Fran, for everyone, is that the NEC believes, even though it's very likely that at some point later this year or early next, we will need to take industrial action, it is not right to ask people to take that action now, when firstly, members do not know exactly how much money they're going to get, and secondly, until we know the outcome of the national talks. Because if we did so, we'd be asking people to lose pay and take strike action when we do not yet know what the negotiations that your strike action have won are going to deliver. So we're recommending that we urgently get into those talks, and in fact, we are already in those talks with each individual employer, We're able to tell you exactly what consolidated pay rise you're going to get, and we're able to report back to you what comes out of the national talks over the next few months. So I think it's just worth considering how that might look and what people will need to consider. Now, firstly, a lot of questions have come in, Fran, where people don't quite understand the way that pay is negotiated in the civil service. And a lot of members have seen what pay rises are going to happen in the Home Office and are asking, well, why can one department get that and everyone else isn't getting the same? So the first thing to stress is that we do not have national pay bargaining in the civil service. Mrs. Thatcher took that away over 30 years ago and replaced it with a system where we have to negotiate your pay with over 200 separate departments and employers. We believe that's wrong, and we are constantly trying to persuade the government, and we are currently trying to persuade the Labour opposition that the government should go back to a system where we have one set of pay talks for everyone. But we don't have that at the moment. And that is why once the government conceded pay remits would increase, our job now has to be to get into every individual employer to find out how much you're going to get. Now, in some cases, that has become clear. Recently in the Home Office, members may have seen that we have published figures that tell us the Home Office are considering paying the lowest paid pay increases in some cases in double digits, and in many cases 7 or 8%. Other departments have already told us that what they're going to be paying is more in the region of 4.5% across the board, with up to 5% for some of the lowest paid. Many employers, though, are still in talks with PCS. So, for example, in the DWP and in HMRC, those talks are taking place as we speak. So the NEC believes that wherever you work, it's very important that you know how much money you're going to get, because that is bound to be a deciding factor on your willingness to take further strike action. In some cases, it's clear that some members will get more than other public sector workers, but others face getting less. What we want to do is ensure that everybody's very clear exactly how much they're going to get. The next thing we want you to be clear about is whether the talks that your strike action have won are going to make any difference. If those talks deliver changes in civil service pay structures, or critically at the moment, something done that opens up differentials between AAs and AO grades, for example, to ensure that people are not paid the same money for doing work that is a very different sort of complexity, then that will be a huge step forward for the union, and many members would welcome that. If the talks don't deliver the changes that we need to see, members should know that and should be aware of that in case we need to move to further strike action. So, Fran, in conclusion, in the ballot next week, the NEC will ask members whether they agree with our strategy or not. And our strategy, to sum up, is this. We ensure everybody gets the £1,500 payment. I can tell you that virtually every employer has now agreed to pay that. Some members have already received it, and some, even today, have been forced to pay it because of the threat to strike action. So everybody needs to get that money. Secondly, every member needs to see what the employer gives them in a consolidated pay rise. That is going to come clear over the next couple of weeks. Thirdly, we're asking you to agree that we should get into the national talks and report back to you whether they make any material difference to low pay issue, pay structures, and job security. Fourthly, we want to go to the Court of Appeal to see if we can win you your pensions money back. And it's important.
Mark, you've muted yourself.
Sorry. And fourthly, we'll go to the Court of Appeal and report back to you as to whether or not we've made any progress on the question of your pensions. As that's taking place, Fran, we're asking people to agree that we should pause strike action at this moment, pause the levy, in order to ensure that those talks can deliver and we can tell you exactly how much you're going to get. If you agree that strategy, we will immediately suspend the levy, get into the talks and report back to members. And when everything becomes clear, we will consult further about whether we've got enough or we need to move to further industrial action, hopefully with other unions later in the year. Final thing to say, Fran, is therefore, I hope that what we're clear about is nobody believes what we've got is enough. We hope we all agree we've won stuff because of the strike action, but now we need to see exactly what that means for each individual member. It's very important we do that. But the other thing to stress is in the consultation exercise that we run, an overwhelming majority of branches were clear that members would not support calling further strike action now because people were concerned as to whether or not we could deliver that action until we knew the outcome of the talks. And one of the things members may want to consider and ask questions about tonight is if we do not pause the action to maximise what we can get out of the talks, that means that we must agree to move on with action now. The NEC believes that the feedback we've had tells us that members don't support striking now over the summer when we have less people with live mandates than we've had at any other point. We believe, and we hope that members will agree with us, that if we're going to take further strike action, you need to know exactly how much money you've got. We need to ensure that that strike action involves all of our members and, crucially, hopefully takes place with other unions later on in the year. So, Fran, I hope I've been able to explain what we think is the best way forward to make it clear that what we've won has only been won because of your strikes. We do not believe it is enough, but we think you deserve to know exactly what pay rise you're getting and what comes out of the national talks, and then we should make a further assessment later on in the year. So I hope, Fran, that's been clear about what the NEC is advising members to do. But obviously, I'd be very happy to deal with any questions, to clarify anything else. And to finally remind people, the ballot will start next week. There will be a ballot insert that explains in detail exactly what the NEC is asking members to vote for. And then we're asking everyone to vote in the ballot. Your NEC will meet first week of September once we've got the results. And whatever you voted for, the NEC will take forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. And hopefully people have found that helpful. Okay, so there are a number of questions either coming in through the chat or being sent in advance. And what I'll try and do is get through as many of those as possible. So with only one speaker on the call, clearly I'll be calling on Mark quite a lot to respond. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just see if there are any questions that I can lump together. So straight away, there are a couple. Paul Anderson from the DWP asks, if the police are to receive a 7% pay rise this year and the cost of living for the DWP is the same as for police colleagues, will PCS campaign for pay increase parity rather across public services? And Julie says, can you please explain why HMRC is not covered by any pay review body? Does this therefore mean that the 6% pay rise suggested by Rishi Sunak will not therefore be offered to HMRC staff? So do you want to give a bit of clarity there, Mark, in terms of what we've seen in the press quite recently around pay review bodies and offers of 6% around the public sector?
Certainly, and thanks for both of those questions from Paul and from Julie. The first thing to say is that pay review bodies can be highly misleading because when the media report on them, the impression given is that pay review bodies cover the whole of the public sector, and in reality, they don't. The civil service has never been part of a pay review body. Only senior civil service are covered by a pay review body. Local government is not covered by a pay review body. The fire service isn't covered by a pay review body. But it does cover health, education, and the police. And therefore, the pay review body announcements do not cover us. What they indicate is clearly what the government has been persuaded in those sectors is the rate to pay those sectors. The prison officers, for example, are getting a 7% award from their pay review body. And the reason they're in a pay review body is because they don't have the right to strike. So to be clear, we have never had what pay review bodies recommend because we're not covered by them. And in some years, parts of the public sector not in pay review bodies have done better than what pay review bodies recommend. And in others, we've not done quite as well. This year's pay review bodies have ranged between 5.5% to 7%. They're 5.5% for the senior civil service. They are 7% for the police and prison officers, 6.5% for teachers. So that's why HMRC is not covered by it. And obviously, the problem with the pay review body is your pay is determined allegedly by independent experts and isn't determined by the right of your union to individually negotiate and hopefully put pressure on. However, we do believe that what the pay review bodies do set us is a benchmark. And to answer the first question, we are saying to employers and the government that we should not be getting less than anyone else. It's frankly insulting that they think that we should accept less than 5.5%, for example, if the most senior civil servants are getting 5.5%. We know already in the Home Office that our low-paid members are going to get far more than any pay review body recommendation. And therefore, what we have to do is judge in the round. And this is why we think it's really important we get into the talks so that we know exactly how much you have got. And if what we've got is not enough, if it's less than everybody else is getting, we should have no hesitation in saying that's not acceptable and we should move on to consider further strike action later on in the year. But ultimately, hopefully, Paul and Julie would understand that we think you need to know exactly what you're going to get before we ask you to take further industrial action.
Okay, thanks so much, Mark. And my apologies, because actually Julie turned out to be Jonathan. That question, the Julie question, was from Jonathan Abraham. But Julie asked a question that a number of people are asking. Julie Davis says, what does the campaign involve for equality around the £1,500 lump sum? Could this result in an employment tribunal? And that really encapsulates a number of questions that have come in, lots and lots of interest. Kim Waters says, I would like an update on the lump sum pro rata situation. And Leanne says, is there any update on the 1,500 for part-timers being paid in full, or on getting a top-up if we already have received the payment? So clearly lots and lots of interest, Mark, and no easy answer, because obviously, as you've explained, pay is delegated to departments to deal with. But is there anything you'd like to say about all of that?
Yeah, well first of all, just to say that we believe it is unacceptable that part-time workers on a payment that's supposed to compensate for the cost of living crisis are asked to get less. The government originally took the view that that would be left to the individual employers, but they made it clear that the health service had prorated their payments and the education service were going to do the same before the one-off payments were withdrawn. And basically their case is that with all pay-related and contractual matters, part-time workers get a prorating of pay based on the amount of hours they work. Our case has been, if these were consolidated pay increases, we would understand why there was a prorating, but they're not. And therefore, if you're a part-time worker, you're more likely to be lower paid, be a woman, have the same cost of living pressure, so it's unfair. Now, to be frank, all efforts to negotiate with the government have so far proved unsuccessful. With individual employers, we have persuaded some to pay a flat rate, but it's a minority. We know that some other employers wanted to pay it flat rate, but then were persuaded by other departments not to do so. So our view is this is unacceptable, and how we want to take this forward is two ways. Firstly, in both national and delegated negotiations, we continue to make the point that it's unfair and employers should rethink. Where they're not rethinking, we are seeking to try to get that dealt with in the pay talks themselves, because if part-time workers have had this injustice, we want to see whether there's a way of rebalancing that in the pay talks. Thirdly, we're considering our legal options. Now, at the moment, we've taken extensive legal advice under 5 different pieces of legislation, and the advice we're getting is not strong that legal action is likely to be successful. However, what we continue to do is to pursue all legal avenues and different ways of trying to see if this process can be overturned. But we'll continue in the campaign to make it clear that particularly if what comes out of the talks does not resolve all of these problems and we're going to take further strike action, that justice for part-timers will be very integral to what we're seeking through any further strike action that we're forced to take later this year, Fran, or early next.
Okay, thank you. Okay, not altogether unsurprisingly, there are a number of questions around the Home Office and what looks to be an excellent deal there. So James McAngus from the HMRC says, I want to ask why the Home Office has announced high pay awards of up to 9% for all staff on their intranet, whilst other departments are still negotiating. Mark Smithson from the HMRC says, are PCS intending to use their negotiations with various departments our PCS intend to use in their negotiations with various departments the Home Office's 23-24 offer of the 20th of July as an absolute minimum that they will consider putting to members, And Leslie Fisher says, whilst it's great that the Home Office has secured an increased pay offer, what are we doing about getting the same for other departments that are still looking at 4.5%? PCS now needs to campaign and reballot those that didn't get over the 50% so Action can continue to secure increased deals. So quite a lot in there. And clearly you went to some length, Mark, to explain about delegation and the fact that we're not all covered by the same pay arrangements. But is there anything you want to say on those specifics?
Yeah, and thanks very much for the questions. And just again, to just remind people, certainly when I started in the civil service, that's a long time ago, we had national pay bargaining and we'd have one set of pay talks, essentially with the Treasury, and everybody got the same. And Margaret Thatcher's government broke that up because she knew that it would be divisive and it would weaken the unions. And we have now for over 3 decades been trying to get back to national pay bargaining. We are, in the talks we are having nationally, restating our belief that national pay bargaining is essential. It's the only way you can have equal pay for work of equal value. And ultimately, we believe that our employer is the Crown, not individual departments. So to stress, we're continuing to make that case. We're going to be making it with the general election looming, that a new government needs to do something about it. But at the moment, we don't have that. It's one of the reasons why, even with the £1,500, what should have been a simple, straightforward, everybody getting £1,500, had to go into over 200 sets of talks with employers. So because pay is determined by each individual employer under the terms of the remit the government issues, it means we have to get into those talks. And those talks are faster in some places than others. And what's happened here is in the Home Office, those talks have been conducted faster than in other areas. And therefore we believe, and it come back to the point, that it's essential. If you're in HMRC at the moment, you need to know exactly how much we've been able to get out of the employer in the talks. Whatever grade you're in, you need to know that in HMRC, and everybody else needs to do the same. Obviously, your negotiators everywhere are looking at the Home Office deal and are making the argument, if it's good enough there, it should be good enough for us. We're also making the point, if other people are getting higher awards from pay review bodies, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And ultimately, we believe that it's only when we've been through that process, everybody knows exactly what the employer intends to give them wherever you work, and that will form a judgment for us moving forward. And I hope people can understand that when we did the consultation, one of the most regular things that members said is that they need to understand how much consolidated rise they're getting, and the sooner they knew that, the better. And that's why we believe getting into these talks is important. Do we believe that these talks are likely to mean that all of our members will get pay rises that we think are acceptable? No, we don't. But it's clear from the talks that we've had that lower paid members may well get more than they were expecting, and they need to know that before we could ask people to take any further strike action. So I hope that explains the process. But I just want to end by saying this, that what people therefore shouldn't lose sight of is the fact that the government has conceded talks around pay coherence and civil service pay structures is very significant. Because in those talks, we intend to be saying right up front at the very first meeting, we need to dismantle delegated pay and have a national system. Otherwise, these injustices will always continue. And we think you need to know the outcome of that. If the government makes a move, I'm sure that that needs to be taken into account before we decide if we go on strike again. If the government say, no, we're not budging, we're making no changes, then clearly it's more likely we will want to take further industrial action. But I think if I could sum up in a sentence, Fran, I think we believe that if and when we need to take further industrial action, and in all likelihood we probably will need to, as will other parts of the public sector, given the way the government is teeing up, that action has to be bigger and the best supported that we've ever had. And to get to it being bigger and better supported, it's clear that members will need to know exactly how they fare. And that's why we think a pause in the strike action now, so you can be clear what we've managed to get to you, is the logical part of the strategy.
Okay, thank you, Mark. There are a few questions here, which again, I think we can lump together. Not surprisingly, AOs in particular really feeling the pinch, and those are the lowest grades of the AAs and the AOs. So Elsa Quinn says, please can I ask about the AO grade? I work in the DWP. I'm currently, as you know, getting the minimum wage. Same as AAs, same as the AA grade now. My question is, what's happening with our wages and why am I being paid the same as an AA after 40 years service? Kevin Rogers said, what's happening with regards to the AA and AO pay? The Home Office announcement suggested that AA staff will receive a higher offer compared to AOs. If both are on the national living wage, does this mean that AAs overtake AOs on the bottom of their pay scales, which is obviously, although that's partly about delegation, it makes the same points, I think, about the lowest pay. And Elizabeth Jane Allsop says, hi, Mark and Fran. My question is, do you believe that our lowest paid should be on the minimum wage for the responsibility that we have? So, lots of questions there, Mark, about what has really been a bit of an annihilation of the grading system in many departments because of the fact that so many fell below the living wage when the living wage was uplifted in April. So is that something you would be able to comment on?
Yes, and thanks for all those points. And just to pick up Elizabeth's points first, the answer is no, it's not acceptable. No civil servant should be getting paid less than the national living wage or the minimum wage. It never used to be the case, and it's happened because the national living wage has risen through government decision while civil service pay has essentially been frozen or cut in real terms. And that is why there are now tens of thousands of people on the national living wage. And the unintended consequence of that for the government is that it has collapsed our grading system, because the whole point of a grading system is people are promoted into work of more responsibility, and that is reflected in their pay. And that is why they know this system is not sustainable. The departments know it is not sustainable. And they know that when they're advertising internal promotions and are not getting any applications, it's because people tend to think, why would I do work of more responsibility and not get any more pay than I'm getting? So none of this is acceptable, and it is the product of a decade of pay problems. We also, by the way, don't believe that it's right that people should be claiming universal credit. We think that people should have a pay that takes them above the benefit, means-tested benefit levels. And we've all seen, because again, our pay is so low, that when the government decided to give people a one-off payment, it causes problems for people on universal credit. If I could just say about that it is important people know that we have tried very hard to do something about that. And currently, we have MPs who are trying in Parliament to get the government to agree that the one-off payment should be disregarded for universal credit purposes. That'll be a government decision, but I hope what it gives people the clear impression of we're not letting this stuff lie, we're trying to challenge it in any way that we can. So none of this is acceptable. But it is the case that when people get their consolidated pay rise this year, we may find that the differential opens up for a small period of time, because AOs, for example, may get a higher pay rise than AAs. But as soon as the national living wage is uprated, people will be back probably in the same position. It is why it is the number one issue on our agenda in the national pay talks that are going to start next week. National pay is obviously top of our list in terms of wanting structural change so that we all get the same pay across the whole of the civil service. But within the system that we have at the moment, we are making it clear that the government and the Cabinet Office must intervene to reintroduce differentials between the grades and lift people above the level of the living wage. That will be an important part of the talks. I can't stress enough that I agree with all the questions that say this is unacceptable. And again, what we're recommending here is, whilst we pause the industrial action to have these talks, if we make progress, that's really important. And it may well mean that for many people, that alleviates the need to strike. If the talks do not solve these problems, we will be reporting that back to people later in the year. And if then we decide we need to take further industrial action, at least you will all know what pay rise you've had, the fact that the talks did not deliver what we wanted, and that we then can move forward in unity, reballot, and actually take industrial action in bigger numbers, potentially with other unions, Fran. So we agree with the questions. We're going to try and see what we can do about it in the talks. But if they don't deliver, it'll be a very important issue for us in the next round of action later this year or early next.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next few are probably more observations than questions, but I'll read them in a batch. Ryan Bell from DWP says, many of the members in my office told me they felt they couldn't commit to further days strike action, and some have said they would consider leaving if the levy remains in place. I think with that in mind, pausing and consulting is the right thing to do. Mo Brazier says, the majority of members I've spoken to have indicated they support the NEC strategy as they recognise the concessions was being gained by the action taken by members. And Jimmy Gill says, I can't see anything wrong with this strategy at all. We have already won 100% increase of the original offer. The campaign has been a new way of fighting for PCS. It's been very carefully implemented and is moving us towards what we want to be. So all of those, questions, thank you for sending your comments in, and those are welcomed. The next sort of batch of questions, though, Mark, are all around overtime ban, work to rule. So Jane Green says, why was our lump sum not consolidated? We've talked about the lump sum, so we're moving on from that a little bit. Why are we not working to rule? And surely there should at least be an overtime ban. Hayley Sully says, I would like to ask why we can't be balloted on action short of a strike for this year's derisory 4.5 to 5% offer. My branch members at a DWP office will probably vote no to further strike action, as they say they can't afford it, but they would vote yes to action short of a strike. And Kevin Rogers, I think we can probably take that one alongside those, who says, why are we still paying a levy whilst action is frozen? It should be stopped whilst we're balloting and see if we want to accept less than 50% of the original 10% that was asked for from the government. So okay. So do you want to come back on some of that, Mark? Very much, the first few were really observations, but both Jane Green and Hayley Sully are asking about work to rule, overtime ban, and whether those sorts of things are being considered or have been considered.
Yes, but if I can't start with the levy though, Fran, as I came up in two of those contributions and questions. So first of all, let's just say the introduction of the levy, it's the first time we've ever done it, and the levy produced the action that has forced the government to make concessions. So whilst I think we would want to acknowledge that whether people are paying £3 or £5 at a time when everybody is struggling with the cost of living crisis, that is not insignificant. What it did is it raised £3 million, which the union matched with a further £3 million centrally, and allowed us to pay £6.2 million in strike pay. That meant we had some members on strike for extended periods of time, but in truth built the pressure, along with the 3 one-day strikes, that forced the concessions in the first place. So the beauty of the levy is everybody pays in order to allow some people who can have a big impact to take action on everybody else's behalf. And I think that the thing the NEC has also always been clear about is for many low-paid members, £3 or £5 a month for people to take action as one concessions is more affordable than the amount of unpaid action that other unions have had to take, like the RMT and the postal workers, 20 days of strike action that many members told us they couldn't afford. That's why we did the levy, and it's meant that we're all in it together. Now, the NEC is proposing that we pause the levy if this strategy is agreed, because the industrial action would at that point pause. But it's important to say at the moment that there has still been industrial action that we have had to take or threaten for employers, for example, who haven't agreed to pay the £1,500. So the money that comes in and is still coming in is in the strike fund. It will pay anyone who has to go on strike to get the things that some of us have had, but some of us haven't. But equally importantly, it will remain in the strike fund so that if we conclude we have to take further strike action later on in the year, when we know what comes out of the talks, we have money that we can kick that off straight away. So that's the reason why it is in place now, but it will stop if members endorse the strategy. But I can reassure anyone on the call that every single penny collected can only go in the strike fund to pay strike pay in this campaign now or in the future. In terms of the overtime ban question and the strike question itself, so just to be clear, the union strategy has been to say that in any employer where members or reps feel that action short of a strike is an effective weapon, the NEC has said we would have that ballot. And in one group of the union, in EFRA, members there have voted for action short of a strike. They voted for it and beat the threshold, and that has been part of their campaign. No other part of the union, not a single one, has asked the NEC to have a ballot in their area. The reason why the NEC didn't have a national ballot is because we're made up of so many different employers that actually the action short of a strike tactic, whether that's an overtime ban or a work to rule, varies very much in terms of the type of work that members do, whether or not overtime is contractual in some areas or whether or not it is effective. We are clear that if you work in whatever department the question has come from, members felt that action short of a strike would be supported and would have an effect. We would be very happy to have that ballot and to start that action. What we believe, however, is that the action short of a strike is unlikely to have been as effective as the targeted action, which clearly has rocked the government, and of course would need to be something that we would show would have an industrial effect. So I want to make this clear to everyone now that if we pause the action and we decide that the talks haven't delivered enough and we move into further strike action later in the year, wherever you work, if you believe that you should have an action short of a strike ballot, tell your reps that. And if your lay committee asks the NEC for authority for a ballot, I'm pretty sure that the NEC will say yes. But what we probably will not want to do is to impose that everywhere when people do not think that's a legitimate tactic. So I hope what that gives is an explanation. And as one of the questions came from the DWP there, Fran, what DWP members would have to decide is whether they believed an action short of a strike ballot is more effective than taking national action and supporting others taking targeted action for long periods. And obviously that's a matter for people in the DWP to work out, because we know that for many members, they would say they'd support action short of a strike, but many members don't get offered overtime, and many members who work it, obviously we have to persuade them that they would be prepared to not do that as part of the campaign and it would be effective. So what I'm trying to explain here is we've had very long, detailed discussions, but the union's national position is anywhere where people think that works, if your lay leadership in your employer asks for authority for a ballot, I'm pretty sure that the NEC would agree, and indeed, when it was asked, did agree in EFRA.
Okay, thanks very much. Matthew Wright from DEFRA, your question is very much one that needs to be answered within your departmental group. So if you contact your branch or DEFRA GC, they'll be able to answer your question, which is, could you put pressure on the employer to publish numbers of how many staff are on starting pay for each grade by length of service, and has that ever been seriously discussed? So as we explained, pay is delegated. That would be a matter for delegated discussions within DEFRA, but you should be able to ask that information via your GC or via your branch in the first instance. And Lorraine has pay progression, Lorraine Fellows, has pay progression been actively used or considered as a negotiating point with the employer? Yeah, pay progression is always discussed both in delegated talks and national ones. I don't know, Mark, if you want to comment specifically on pay progression. I mean, it exists in departments where there's not a spot rate, but is there anything you want to say on that particularly?
Well, only again, that is always an issue that is taken up in a delegated set of negotiations, Fran. We are very well aware that many members, because there hasn't properly been adequate pay progression, or we have people on the max who often tell us that they feel that they get the least and often get non-consolidated pay rises. We don't just raise it with the employer, we want to raise it centrally as well. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why we think one of the biggest changes that needs to be made is national pay bargaining, because if we had that, we would be able to ensure that we had the same pay system across the board, and that should either be spot rates or it should be guaranteed progression over a short period of time. So the union will pursue it nationally and is currently pursuing it in the delegated talks. Also, Fran, I think it probably is worth saying, because a number of comments were received earlier on in the campaign, is that we're very conscious that we have many low-paid members who, as we know, are on the national minimum wage or are getting universal credit, and clearly we want to try to do the most we can to obliterate the epidemic of low pay. But we are also aware that we have tens of thousands of members who are not on the lowest pay rates, but are still not very well paid. And of course, one of the things we'll need to assess in the delegated talks is how have we done for the lowest paid, but also how have we done for people in the middle grades and higher. And ultimately, we keep making the point that our assessment on where we've got to needs to take into account for all members and must be something that we understand, and that will only happen when these delegated talks finish over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. I want to make time for Patricia McDermott's question, which is, I would like to know why Scottish members who have settled their pay claims should continue to pay the levy in support of non-Scottish members obtaining a cost of living crisis payment that they will not receive. Now, clearly, I think Mark's covered a number of times the issue of pausing the levy as part of this, but Mark, I don't think you want to comment specifically around members who, you know, in Scottish government and Scottish administrations have already settled their pay claim.
Well, I think there's two things to say about it. I mean, firstly, the concept of the levy was that we are all paying in because we're running a national campaign, and it's a campaign on behalf of everyone. And therefore, clearly, while some places may have settled, you know, arguably, one of the reasons that that settlement was able to be achieved was because the National Union was campaigning, and that meant that some employers did better than others. And clearly in the devolved sectors, certainly in Scotland, that took place. But in a spirit of solidarity, you know, we hope that Scottish members still care about those people who have not yet managed to get the same levels of pay. So I think there is the solidarity argument that we want everybody to do better. But the key argument also in the Scottish devolved sector is that the dispute was not just about pay. It was about job security and it was about pensions. And of course, whether you're in the devolved sector in Scotland or work anywhere else, no one has had that pension issue resolved. And part of our objective in this campaign is to get everybody back the 2% that they've been overpaying, an average of £2,000 per member since April 2019. And that has not been resolved in Scotland. And were we to be successful on that, then clearly everybody would benefit. So that's why people are paying into the levy at the moment, even though some have had outcomes that are acceptable and others haven't. But to stress, the NEC is suggesting that all people paying the levy would pause if the vote is in favour of this strategy, to allow people to have the respite of paying that extra money in until we can see how we've done in the talks across the piece. But to be clear, if we needed to move to further strike action later on in the year or early next, I think the NEC's view is we would want to start up again a means of raising the money like we've just done, because what we shouldn't lose sight of is we have achieved more in this campaign, even though it's not enough, than any other previous national campaign that we have seen in decades. And the levy was a fundamental part of why we were able to do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's a couple of questions from HMRC members. Jeremy Wattrick from East Kilbride HMRC says, why are you wasting the current mandate for strike action? And HMRC Benton Park View, a branch that have obviously benefited from the levy and taken targeted action, say our members have taken a combined 14,000 days of strike action since HMRC joined the dispute. We and they are pleased by the concessions made so far, and everybody recognises it wouldn't have been achieved without our industrial action. Given the concessions that have been made, our members don't understand why further strike action should be off the table, given that even ministers admit it's the only thing that moves the window. We would like to hear an answer to this question. So the whole issue of, you know, different groups having different mandates and HMRC members asking about that. So I'll put those questions to you, Mark.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say, which is the obvious thing, is that a strike is a means to an end. It's not a principle. The reason we go on strike is to put more pressure on to get better outcomes. When people go on strike, obviously they're making a big sacrifice. And the NEC's proposition in this ballot is that the strikes we've had so far have won concessions. They're not enough, but until the talks are concluded, nobody really knows yet exactly what they're getting. And therefore, to ask people to strike when it is not clear doesn't seem to be the right thing. Secondly, were we to call a strike today, it would be the smallest strike that the union would have called so far, because less people are covered by a mandate now than previously the case, and we would have to re-win some ballots. So the issue, if we were to call a strike today, actually would be we're not showing our strength to the employer. If anything, we're showing them that we're in a slightly weaker position now than we were 6 months ago. The NEC's view is if we have to take further strike action, and I think I've been pretty clear, the way the government is preparing, you can see that they are likely to come for the public sector again later this year or early next. So when we take further strike action, we want to go into that from a position of people thinking strikes have won something, they knew exactly what it won them, and we take this period to ensure that the next strikes are bigger and stronger. Were we to call a strike today, there would be no DWP. The feedback we got, and I think it's important to say this, was that most branches did not support taking further action. And Fran, the reason I'm stressing that point, particularly for the question you said we're wasting the mandate, is that if when you do a consultation and 163 branches respond, and 69 of those say we are prepared to take further action, 94 of them do not think that's right, it tells us at a minimum that action is not supported by a majority, or at best, it's pretty close. When we call strikes, what we want to be is in a position where we're all very united and pulling in the same direction. And therefore, rather than seeing it as wasting a mandate, what I would put it as is we want to have the talks that the strikes have won. And when we ask people to make a further sacrifice, they know exactly what was won for them. If it's not enough, we should absolutely be prepared to go again later this year or early next. But if it produces more than we're expecting in the talks, then clearly we think members would want to know that before we ask them to take further industrial action. And I think ultimately, if you believe that action is likely needed in the future, isn't it better to go into that in a stronger position than call action now, which would actually expose we're in a weaker position?
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Okay, next question then. Fergal Clark asks, what will the question be on the ballot paper?
So everyone will get a ballot insert that will set out in some detail the NEC strategy, which Fran, I've tried to explain tonight, which is we're asking people to agree that we should ensure everyone gets the 1,500. We make sure that everybody has had their delegated talks, so members know exactly what consolidated rise they have. That we're asking you to agree we should get into the national talks, take the legal action on pensions, and pause the strikes whilst those talks are taking place, and therefore pause the levy. And the question would be a very simple, whether or not you agree with the strategy as set out, yes or no.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of questions which I'm not going to cover because they're very DWP specific. They're first the employee deal, and there will be plenty of opportunity once we have a DWP specific offer to discuss those in more detail with DWP members. There is a question from Sharon Elisa who says, sorry, not Sharon Elisa, that was the DWP question. Sorry, there's a question from Asta Rex who makes the point that because of the student loan, not only has the lump sum been taxed and prorated for some, but for those who are repaying a student loan, there's been a hike in the repayment rate of the student loan. And absolutely, that certainly somebody in my own branch contacted me today with the same issue as just. So that is something we're very conscious of, and something that, as Mark has outlined, we continue to raise in the negotiations. We then get on to, Mark, questions around what happens next. So Katie Leslie says, does voting yes mean we accept the 22-23 offer? So we would be accepting a below inflation offer. And if members vote no, what difference would that make to the strategy? E.g., will it mean continuing to argue for higher pay for 22-23, not only 23-24? And Victoria says, can you explain what happens if members vote no in the ballot? So you may want to cover that next.
Yeah, so if people vote yes, what that means is that essentially, in a nutshell, everybody will know what consolidated pay rise they're going to get. I should be clear, Fran, that we will not be accepting in any individual employer what comes out of the delegated round. I think it's important to say this, that our view is that only the union nationally, when we've seen the whole lot can make a judgment across the board. So what will happen is some employers will impose now pay. We're trying to make sure we get the best that we can. But no, the union will not be agreeing it to end a dispute in any individual employer. I think that's important to say. So if people vote yes, we'll get the talks. Everybody will know exactly what consolidated rise they're having. We'll have the other talks. And then later on in the year, we will assess exactly where we've got and come back out to members to see whether or not we believe we're in a position that we've got enough or we're moving to further industrial action. If people vote no, because just to be clear, what no one is proposing here is we end the campaign. It's not a question of are we ending the campaign or carrying on. The NEC believes the campaign should continue, but the next phase should be to get the talks and then assess once we know where they've come, what they've delivered. So if people voted no to the NEC strategy, then essentially the NEC, and my view would be, Fran, that what people are telling us essentially from that is that they don't want to pause the strikes whilst the talks are taking place. And what the NEC would then need to do is to consider how we could then move on the back of that to take industrial action now. And that's the way I think, the decision that we will have. We don't believe anyone thinks that we should shut up shop and say we're happy and we call the campaign off. So what this really is about is, do we believe it's right to pause the action so you know what the talks have delivered, or to believe that people just think we should be taking strikes now? And that is the essence of the question that I think that we're asking people to vote for. But I stress that the NEC will meet in less than a week after this ballot closes on the 31st of August. And we will ensure that once we've had that meeting, we will have further communications and announcements, probably other events like this, to explain exactly what we believe needs to happen next.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm very conscious of the time. We've just gone over the hour. So we've covered an awful lot of your questions. If your question hasn't been covered or you feel that there's more you would like to ask, you can by all means get in touch with us, and we'll make sure that we capture all of the questions that have been raised tonight. But Mark, is there anything you would like to say in closing?
Yeah, well, I want to thank everybody for the questions, Fran, and I'm just asking everybody, I suppose, as we finish, because we've had a lot of detail there, is in many ways, I think, where we are is fairly straightforward. Firstly, we would not be having this meeting or discussing any of these talks if we hadn't taken the strike action and forced the government to do what they're doing. If we hadn't have done that, there'd be no £1,500. Last year's pay would have been shut down. We would have had probably 2% for this year, and we would have had the redundancy cuts. And let's remember, that's a 33% cut in people's redundancy entitlement. So it's your strikes that have delivered the progress we've made, and crucially, the further talks. But we're all clear that what we've got at the moment is not enough, and the campaign should continue. And the question we're really asking is, what's the best way to continue that campaign and put more of the pressure on? And in your heart of hearts, the NEC believes that when we asked in the consultation, that the clear response that came back is that people believe that going on strike is a big thing. It costs people money. It's your last resort. That people will be prepared to take further strike action if we recommend so in the future. But they want to know exactly whether the talks have won them any more and what rises they're getting. I think we should be clear. In the Home Office, we know there are thousands of members who are going to get a bigger consolidated pay rise than they expected. And they have a right to know that before we ask them to take further strike action. It's also clear that there will be thousands of members who will not get a pay rise after these delegated talks that they think is acceptable. And that's why we have to be able to quantify that for you and make a decision moving forward. So in many ways, the key question is, how do we put more pressure on the government to deliver more? Is it to call a strike now in the summer, which would be the smallest strike that we've had so far, when very few other unions are doing the same? And would that make it stronger leverage on the government? Or is it much more sensible to do the talks, keep building the union, and when we ask if we have to take further strike action later in the year, it's because you know exactly what the talks delivered, and we're in a much stronger position to take effective action, and potentially with others. My own take, Fran, is a further strike action is very, very likely, because I think the government's answer to its economic woes will be to try to take it out on the public sector. If that's the case, it's a question of when, not if, And if it's when we're going to take action, it's in all of our interests, I think, to ensure it's bigger, better supported, potentially with other unions, so that we can do what we've just done, which is strikes force them to concede things they weren't planning to do. And I think that's something I would hope we could all unite on. We want more. We're determined to try to fight to get more. But the best way to do that is to find out exactly what we've got for you and to ensure any further strikes are bigger and everybody can believe it's got a chance of winning more, rather than letting the government off the hook. And frankly, the NEC believes, were we to call a strike now that would be smaller than any other, that would give the government probably the idea that they could treat us even harsher than they may be planning. Strikes are about showing our strength, and we think the NEC strategy is the best way of showing our strength to the employer and winning more.
Okay, thanks so much. And thank you everybody for those questions. And obviously we've covered a lot of ground, but clearly there is a lot going on. So in conclusion then, the ballot starts electronically at the end of next week. It runs from the 3rd of August to the 31st of August. We want as many people as possible to participate and have your say. So clearly we want you to vote, but what would be really helpful is if you can talk to your colleagues, friends and people you work with and encourage them to vote as well. If people aren't in the union yet, we need them to join us, because obviously the more people that are, the stronger we're going to be in all of our campaigning. And we need to stick together and stand up for each other, don't we? So it's really important that we get the outcome from the ballot. We test the talks that, let's be clear, have only come about as a result of the action that you have all taken, that we've all taken together. So we need to test those negotiations. We need to get the outcome of the delegated pay talks that many groups will be involved in right now, so that when the NEC meets at the beginning of September, it has a really clear picture of where people are, what they're going to get, and what people's views are in terms of the next stages of the campaign. The campaign's not over, as Mark has outlined. There's lots and lots of areas where, whilst we've made progress, we don't feel are good enough. And the way to change that is to have as much of a united campaign as we can. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your questions and comments. As I say, I hope we got through a number of those. Keep in touch with us. We'll speak to you all very soon. Thanks and good night.